Hello and welcome to today's webinar on enrollment reform in the wake of COVID with Parag, Pathak. My name is Greg Bybee and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Avela. And I'll kick us off with a quick introduction on Avela and then pass it over to our speaker. He'll talk about COVID-induced disruption, the enrollment trends that we're seeing, and what opportunities this brings for reform. We'll leave time at the end for Q&A and discussion, but please jump in throughout to ask questions and we'll have a great conversation. So as a quick introduction, this webinar is sponsored by Avela. I just wanted to give you a quick 2-minute overview on who we are, a little bit of a plug for the webinar. And we believe that assigning students to schools is very complicated. Enrollment reform is hard. There's a lot of preferences on the family side and the student side, as well as policy goals, school requirements, eligibility, and so forth. And that's what we've built with Avela, is a tool that can take all of those preferences in, whether there be rankings or weightings or priorities or walk zones or tiebreakers, eligibility requirements, screens, and we take all of that and play that game of Tetris and dominoes to find the optimal allocation of students into schools. And this can be used for the kind of final enrollment lottery to assign students into schools, but it can also be used for simulations, for forecasting, for determining policy, and so on. We offer both our software to run these enrollment lotteries, as well as an engine that can integrate into your existing tools. If you already have an enrollment system, we could be the lottery piece of that. And then we also offer consulting and advisory services. And what we really care about and what motivates us to do this is that we think a lot of effort spent on enrollment is very inefficient, and we can do it much faster, run these scenarios in a matter of seconds, and save school districts a lot of time and money. And most importantly, enable much more equitable outcomes in enrollment by eliminating kind of the implicit bias and privilege that can be baked into enrollment lotteries to make it more fair and equitable. And then also make it more empowering for families. If it's opaque process or confusing and not auditable, that reduces trust in agency. And so we want to make it easy, auditable, transparent, and equitable. And we do this with Nobel Prize winning algorithms on the back end, pioneered by a number of our colleagues, including Al Roth. And we've got a fantastic team of matchmaking experts who co-founded Avela, in particular, Josh Angeris and Parag Pathak, who are both professors of economics at MIT. And that's a perfect segue because one of those experts is leading today's webinar, Parag. And so that I'm pleased to introduce him. He's my co-founder of Avela and our chief economist. He's a professor of economics at MIT. He's also one of the co-founders of the MIT School Effectiveness and Inequality Initiative, SEII, as well as a co-founder of the NBER Working Group on Market Design. And he's an advisor to dozens of school districts on enrollment reform, as well as nonprofits on lottery design and market design, and even the military. And he's the John Bates Clark Medal recipient and is very well educated with a PhD from just down the street in Harvard. So with that, let me turn it over to Parag.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Greg, for that introduction. And thanks also to Avela for sponsoring today's webinar. I'm really excited about the opportunity to bring us together and share with you what I've been seeing and hearing from folks who are managing enrollment and assignment processes this year. As we approach the end of the school year, we thought it would be a good time to have this event. And it's been a tough year. It's been a tough year for everyone. But the bright side is there's been a lot of innovation and reform. The disruptions caused by COVID-19 and a growing urgency over concerns about social justice have created an opportunity to challenge and revisit thinking on school enrollment policy. So before I get into the meat of today's presentation, I'm interested in learning also from you, and I would love to start off by launching a Zoom poll and asking if you could tell me who you are. So on your screen, I hope you see a question. It says, "What's your role?" Please click and answer, and I'll tell you who else is joining us today. Great. Okay, so We have our poll results. Thanks so much for filling this out. We have a good mix of participants online today. The largest group is the district enrollment folks. Thanks so much for joining. We have other district administrators, teachers, philanthropists and funders, policy advocates, and other folks. So thanks very much for filling that out. That's very useful context. And I want to kick things off in my talk today by telling you a little bit about the landscape of K through 12 education in the last year or so, and what we are seeing and hearing from our friends in the field, and what we're also learning from a very early academic research literature on COVID-induced disruption. So it goes without saying that over the last 14 months or so, district leaders, school operators have spent a lot of time on operations, managing uncertainty associated with COVID, and thinking about questions about how to best utilize school facilities. How would we know if we are socially distancing appropriately? What happens to bus transportation in an era of social distancing? Or how should we structure COVID testing? Should it be pooled? Which vendors should we use? How should we reallocate budget for all of these new instructional models that we're experimenting with and this associated staff time? Other questions we hear from our friends are, questions about how much choice should families have over educational models. And here on this slide, I have a clip from our friends from the Lowell Public School District in Massachusetts. And Lowell is one of the few districts out there that actually asked parents what educational model that they'd like. And the article says some have gotten creative. Lowell decided to actually conduct a weighted lottery for in-person slots. So they had more demand for in-person instruction than capacity according to the rules. So they ran a lottery to bring some families back to class. And then finally, the challenging question of how best to communicate with this tremendous uncertainty with parents over the last year or so. Now, on the student side, I think one emerging theme that we're seeing is that COVID-19 has made existing inequalities in K through 12 education more apparent. So many of us know that in K through 12, families that have advantages, families that have wealth, have long been able to obtain their preferred educational offerings for their kids. This is done historically through choosing where to live, residential choice, opting, say, for private schools, or in cities that have choice systems, navigating those systems with skill. But now in the last year, choice options have expanded to include things like fully remote instruction, hybrid instruction, in-person instruction with social distancing, online tutoring, pods, and the early evidence is starting to tell us what we should expect on the effects of these kinds of choices on educational inequality. So let me show you an exhibit that I've extracted from a new paper by Andrew Baker Hicks, Josh Goodman, and Chris Mulhern. And what these researchers do is quite creative. They get access to Google search queries, and they tabulate the difference between high and low SES families in queries for resources on online learning. So prior to March 1st, 2020, there's relatively little difference between these two groups. But right after March 2020, there is a huge increase in search behavior online between high SES families and low SES families, upwards of a 50% difference. So this is one manifestation of the idea that high SES families are more effectively able to navigate the disruption created by the pandemic. Another fact that we're seeing is data from the group at Harvard, Opportunity Insights, which has been collecting information from a leading ed tech provider, Zern. Zern runs an online math platform. That's something that's typically used in combination with hands-on instruction, and they've been very friendly with researcher groups. And what I'm showing you here is a percentage change in engagement with the Zern math platform. And just like the previous figure, once March 2020 hit, what we see is a dramatic, precipitous fall in interaction with this online platform. And that fall has not recovered. So even as of May of this year, there's still about a 20% decline in using the Zern platform. And that decline also splits on SES lines. Here, I'm showing the similar measures of engagement with the Zern platform between high income and low income schools. And both groups at the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020 experienced this drop, but the recovery is much better for the high income schools than the low income schools. As of May, there's still a 22% decline in Zern participation for low income schools relative to a 10% decline for high income schools. Now, the last thing I want to show you about this is some new evidence that was just released last week on learning loss. Now, this is something that's very hard for us to measure. In many places, the school year is still ongoing, but some researchers have put together a very creative study at West Point, okay, where they took students who are required to take introductory economics, and they randomly assigned some to either online instruction or to in-person instruction. And what I'm showing you in this figure is the difference in learning between those who are online versus those who are in person. So each point here reflects a way of measuring learning. And you'll notice that every point here is less than 0, which means that online learning has a negative effect on the final grade that students receive, about a 0.2 standard deviation reduction in final grades, performance on problem sets, homework, exams, midterm performance, and the effects are largest for the academically at-risk students. So the researchers go on to survey online students, and not surprisingly, students have report struggling to concentrate in class and feeling less connected. So this is a bit the landscape that we're in this last year, and it raises the following questions that a lot of our district partners are wrestling with right now. One question is, what role will there be for online or hybrid instruction in fall 2021? Okay, so just a couple of days ago, New York City announced that there would be no remote and hybrid options. The goal is to have everyone in person in school, whereas other districts like Houston and Philadelphia and some districts in California still plan to offer remote options. In Indianapolis, what we're hearing is that students who want remote options will be referred to virtual charter schools that are operating already in the Indianapolis district. So how will families react to this pattern? Will some families demand flexibility in districts that do not offer it? And how do we ensure that some families are not left out? Now, another thing that we're paying a lot of attention to is now that we've spent this year experimenting with different facilities arrangements, different models of education delivery, will this finally be the catalyst that leads to a greater experimental mindset in how we provide K through 12 education? So I can speak from experience. I've had to log into 20 different apps for my children who are in remote instruction, but I've paid that fixed cost, and I think many families have now become more familiar with what types of products are out there. But what we don't know is much about the quality of the various product offerings. There's very few high quality studies on what types of apps and products work best. And there's lots of room, I think, for us to learn more and ensure that there are high quality options, even if they're provided in an online format. So let me now turn to enrollment trends and what we're hearing from our friends who are managing districts and also from the states. The uncertainty created by COVID-19, I think, was an important motivator or instigator of choice. So That's come in many different ways. Families opting for private schools, those deciding to homeschool their children, those delaying elementary school entry, and those leaving urban areas altogether. And the numbers are still quite preliminary, but some of the numbers that I've seen out there are a survey for fall enrollment of a 2% overall drop in public school enrollment. There's evidence that most of that drop is coming from the early grades. So another survey that NPR conducted reported that kindergarten enrollment in the fall dropped by 16%, looking across 60 districts in 20 states. And you might ask, how does this fall across income and racial lines? And what we're seeing so far, and I should emphasize, all of this is very preliminary, okay? We're just coming out of a year of incredible uncertainty, and our ability to measure this stuff is quite preliminary. But so far, it appears that there's no consistent pattern across income and racial lines. And there's lots of potential explanations for that. One could be that some low-income families are avoiding online kindergarten and online pre-K, whereas high-income families are choosing to enroll in private options. So let me pause here. Since we have so many folks from district enrollment offices online here, I want to issue another poll, and we can share kind of thoughts on enrollment. And I'm going to ask what you guys are seeing. So there's a new poll question launched for those of you who are in a district. We're very curious, what did you see in the most recent enrollment season? So please take a moment to fill that out. And some folks are chatting me that total enrollment is down 10%, kindergarten enrollment down 20%. The poll results here show about a third of participants are reporting a slight decline, 5% or less. 28% are reporting a medium decline, 6 to 15%. And then there's one participant who says a large decline of 15% or more. Now, if we look at some of the other facts that we know about this, we've collected information from several newspaper accounts, and we'll circulate these slides later if you're interested on how we got this information. But looking at urban districts, we see, pretty consistent with the overall picture, declines in enrollment between 2 and 4%. San Francisco reported a 2% decline. Boston reported a 4.3% decline. New York City's right in the middle at about 4%. And in all of these places, what we're hearing is that there is a marked decline in K and pre-K enrollment. So in New York, K enrollment is reported to be down by 9%, and pre-K enrollment is down by 13%. So part of, I think what's driving this pattern is that COVID has led families to leave urban areas, especially if some families are able to work remotely. There's also a longer term trend that is underneath these patterns, which is driven by the demographic patterns, a decline in birth rates, and the increasing cost of city living. And another thing that we're hearing from our friends is that some of these enrollment declines are most devastating for small schools like elementary schools, where losing a big chunk of kids makes the schools pretty financially vulnerable. So when we think about what needs to be done, I have a couple of thoughts about the coming school year and the summer. Districts, I think, will have to work extra hard to lure families back who left. Now, many will be wary of another transition between an educational model and the ongoing concerns about childhood vaccination and various COVID variants. And so what is the best strategy to regain trust of families and attract people's back after a year of uncertainty? You know, we're hearing from some friends that they're having open houses or school showcases during the summer. Other districts are experimenting with lots of outreach for summer school programming. Those seem to be some of the main ways that families are getting back into districts and starting to think about whether they want to transition back. Now, if these enrollment declines persist, we have to face the question of what impact will this have on school budgets and resource allocation over the longer term. And here we have an opportunity with the COVID-19 relief in the federal stimulus plan. You know, the best estimates that I've seen is that the plan amounts to about $2,500 for each school child to be spent over the next 2.5 years. So the districts that we talk to, many of them are asking, well, this is a short-term financial boost. How should we spend it? Districts, you know, may need to focus on short-term objectives because there's no guarantee that this additional funding will continue beyond 2.5 years. So that's something I would love to hear from some of our district partners, what they're thinking about and what they may do with these funds and how to combat this decline in enrollment. Kind of a third implication from the decline in enrollment is related to some research work that we've been doing at MIT about pre-K. So there's a growing consensus in the academic literature on the long-term value of early childhood education. We just released a study looking at the long-term effects of getting into pre-K in Boston, the effects on going to college and graduating high school. And what we find is that pre-K actually has a pretty impressive effect on these long-term outcomes. Now, how do we think about that when we just talked about the large decline in enrollment at pre-K and kindergarten? And what I'm very worried about is that we are missing out on these early years, and these early years tend to be quite valuable. So we should expect that there will be long-term consequences on educational attainment from the decline in enrollment at kindergarten and pre-K. So that's on the enrollment side. Now let me turn to some of the innovative things that we've seen districts do in this past year on the reform side with admissions and enrollment. Now, in many ways, this year has presented challenges and opportunities. The challenge, which became an opportunity for several districts, is what happened in spring 2020. So COVID made it very difficult to have standardized tests in spring of 2020. So in school districts that use tests to admit pupils, they didn't have access to the historical measures. So that's kind of fact number one. Fact number two is a brewing long-run concern that many of a district's most sought after schools do not reflect the district's demographic makeup. And, you know, a place for which this conversation has been ongoing for several years is from the clipping on the right, New York City, where the current schools chancellor has commented a couple of weeks ago that the way admissions takes place at the city's elite high schools, schools like Stuyvesant and Bronx Science, where admissions is based on performance on a single test, needs to change. And that's been something that has been a topic of conversation in New York for quite some time. And in this past year, we've seen a kind of renewed attention to issues of social justice and equity. So these factors, the elimination of testing from COVID in spring 2020, heightened concern for social justice, and also some of the things that we're learning from higher ed about test-based admissions policies have spurred many districts to at least think about, and some districts to actually implement new systems, some on a temporary basis and some on a longer term basis. So on the higher ed side, you know, there is a lot of literature that performance on admissions tests like the SAT or the ACT is strongly influenced by race, income, and parental education. And for very much the same reasons that COVID created difficulties in taking and administering standardized tests, in 2020, many colleges and universities waived their standardized test requirements. So some numbers that I've seen on that, about 60% of four-year colleges and universities were test blind or test optional. Now, in many of those colleges, we're still waiting to see what the policies will be for the coming admissions cycle, but some public colleges and universities have gone farther with longer term changes. So in this respect, California is quite noteworthy. So California has a 4-year moratorium on requiring the SAT or ACT as part of admissions. Washington State, Oregon, and Colorado have also made the SAT and ACT optional. And we're still waiting to see what the consequences of this will be. There is a quite lively academic debate about the effects of eliminating the SAT and ACT. Someone who's argued strongly for eliminating the SAT in the Cal system is a colleague of ours, Jesse Rothstein, who's a professor at UC Berkeley. And he's made the claim that alternative measures like GPAs and state-based assessments may be more reliable than the SAT because the SAT is strongly influenced by preparation, okay? It's not necessarily aligned to state curricula. On the other hand, without a measure like the SAT or ACT, schools may rely on things like essays or letters of recommendation. And earlier this week, we had a study released from folks at Stanford showing that relying on essays actually may generate even more inequality. So much remains to be learned about whether the elimination of the SAT will actually be a force towards increasing equity or not, something that many of us are paying attention to. So let's go back to K through 12 and let me tell you about what has happened in a couple of places. So one of the places that has made a pretty substantial change to admissions policies is Boston. So that's where I'm zooming from right now. In Boston, the city is home to 3 different testing schools, the most famous of which is the Boston Latin School. That's the oldest high school in America. It's a school that they joke was, Harvard was created for the graduates of Boston Latin. And for a long time, admissions to Boston Latin School has been based on a combination of performance on a test, the ISEE, and also GPA. But this year, the Boston School Committee eliminated the admissions exam. Okay, this was a 1-year temporary policy, and they decided to base admissions on previous course grades, earlier standardized test score. So this is not the admissions exam for the school, and a student's zip code. So this is the major new innovation. Zip codes are to be ranked by median household income. And eligible students residing in the lowest income zip codes will be guaranteed a seat at their top choice. Okay, so this is an example of what we're seeing more and more of, a place-based admissions policy where slots are rewarded based on a student's neighborhood of residence. And just last week, we're starting to see some facts about this in the media. This has changed diversity at Boston's exam schools. But some feel angry about not getting in. Capacities were not changed in a dramatic way at these schools. So what do we know so far? So on the left here, I'm showing you the racial makeup of 7th grade admissions invitations to Boston Latin School. And on the right, I'm showing you what happened in this past admissions cycle. Okay, so this is hot off the presses, literally last week's newspaper. And what you see here is there was an increase in the number of Black applicants who were admitted, a 14% increase, a 3% increase in Latinx admissions offers, and a 16% decrease in white admissions offers, and a 3% decrease in Asian admissions offers. Okay, so this is showing that the policy changed the racial makeup of offers at the Boston Latin School, and the city is now thinking about what to do for the coming school year. Keep this policy, think about other policies, or go back to their old system. A decision, as far as I know, has not been made yet. One of the things that has been discussed in Boston is looking at what our friends in Chicago have done. So Chicago actually adopted an admission system based on neighborhood of residence several years ago, back in 2009. And in the Chicago system, the way it works is every single census tract is placed into one of four tiers. Tiers one are the most disadvantaged according to a socioeconomic index. That index includes things like the homeownership rate in the tract, or the levels of education, the single-headedness of families in the tract. So group one, or tier one, is the lowest, most disadvantaged census tracts in Chicago. Group four, on the other hand, are considered the most advantaged according to this SES index. And in Chicago's admission system, the way these neighborhood considerations play out is shown on the right here. Let's just focus on Northside, the most selective of the schools in Chicago. At Northside, if I'm an applicant from tier one, so that's in blue here, the score that I need to qualify for admissions is about 100 points lower than if I'm an applicant from tier four, the more advantaged tracks according to this index, okay? So this is how the place-based affirmative action system plays out in Chicago. It affects what score you need to qualify for admissions based on where you live, okay? And by and large, there's about 100 or 80 to 100 point gap between the most disadvantaged and the most advantaged neighborhoods, okay? And so we've been studying this policy over the years. We're grateful to the cooperation of Chicago Public Schools. It's a pretty bold initiative because they had just come out of a consent decree, and they decided to implement this place-based policy. But you know, one of the things that we're starting to understand more and more is in the design of systems like this, it's very important for us to think very carefully about what equitable access actually means, okay? So I have some examples here from some of our research work, which I'm showing you mostly to get you thinking, okay? So I have pairs of students who have applied to particular schools. In my first example, student A and student B have both applied to Walter Payton High School. Okay, so that's one of the most sought after schools. And I have the demographic attributes. Both are Hispanic students. Neither qualifies for a free and reduced price lunch. In Chicago, there is this neighborhood component to assignment, but there's also a test-based component. The test depends on your exam performance on the admissions exam, your performance on other standardized tests, and your school grades. They come up with a composite score. And in our first example, we have a situation where student A has a composite score of 98.8 and is not admitted to Payton, whereas student B has a composite score that's 90.6, so considerably lower, and is admitted to Walter Payton. So if we are to judge equity based on race mix, income status, you might ask, is this kind of system that we want, where student B is getting in and student A is not? Well, of course, the reason this occurred is that the neighborhood that student B lives in is more disadvantaged than the neighborhood that student A lives in, even though both are Hispanic students who do not qualify for a free and reduced price lunch. Okay, so that's just one example. Let me do one other example here just to show you. Let's look at student C and D. So student C and D are both Black students who do not qualify for a free and reduced price lunch, okay? And the composite score of student C is a 98.8, whereas student D has an 89.3, okay? So according to measures of disadvantage, race, and free lunch status, student C and D are identical, but student D is getting an offer at Walter Payton despite having 10 points lower composite score than student C, okay? And here again, this is a consequence of the fact that Chicago's system is using a geographic proxy. It's using the neighborhood characteristic in determining placements, okay? So there are lots of degrees of freedom here and things to think about. Let me show you, okay, one more example. You know, these are just one-off examples, okay? I'm gonna show you something a little bit more systematic in just a second, but I just want you to start thinking about what do we mean by equitable access? How are we going to measure that? What is the goal? And once we ask what the goal is, what is the best way to implement that goal? Let's take a look at I and J. So I and J here, my last one, I promise. Student I is a Hispanic student who does qualify for a free and reduced price lunch and has a higher composite score, a 97, compared to student J, who does not qualify for a free and reduced price lunch, okay? And in the place-based affirmative action system here, student I is not getting an offer at Peyton, whereas student J is getting an offer at Peyton. So student I is eligible for free lunch and has a higher composite score, but does not get an offer relative to student J. Now, another way to look at this and to be a little bit more systematic, and this is based on some academic work that I've done with a colleague here, Glenn Ellison, is to ask the following hypothetical question, okay? Suppose we are to judge the performance of an admissions policy on how well it trades off the incoming scores of kids at a school. So that's here on the y-axis in the figures, relative to some measures of disadvantage. So on the x-axis here on the left, I have the minority share. And the way to read this is the red triangle here is telling us under Chicago's current admissions policy, the average incoming score of a student getting an offer at Northside, okay, that's one of the other popular schools, is about a 97.6. And the average minority share of students at Northside is about 35%. Could we have designed a system that achieved that same level of incoming scores, but had more diversity judged by minority share? And what this arrow here is showing is that if we held fixed the average composite score, it would have been possible to increase the minority share at Northside using a different admissions policy to 50%, okay? So that's room for improvement if our only goal is to have a school be diverse according to minority share. When we move vertically, we have a similar kind of exercise. Let's say we hold fix our target minority share. How much higher incoming student scores could we have gotten? Okay, so at about 35% minority, we could have had an average incoming score of almost 98.7. And so the room for movement, both vertically and horizontally, is room for movement in the admissions policy and the design of the admissions policy. On the right, I'm doing the same kind of exercise where I say, let's define equitable access by looking at measures of low income, the free and reduced price lunch share. And there too, we could have kept the incoming classes scores fixed and had 60% of kids at Northside be free and reduced price lunch, had we designed a different policy. Now, of course, in Chicago, there's this consideration of geography, and that's a significant one when we think about what does equitable access mean. The city's decided that we want to have representation across all of these different neighborhoods, and there's a trade-off, right? So the question that we need to think about is how best to implement policies to minimize how much we need to actually trade off across these different goals. Okay. Now, let me mention a couple of other districts that we talk to frequently and work with, and some of the things they're doing for those of you who don't know. So in New York City, there's been substantial changes at middle and high school. This year, middle schools did not use test scores or other academic screens to select students. At high school, the city eliminated district-based admissions preference. So in some districts, some schools gave priority to pupils who resided in the district in some of the zip codes. So there's a recent press article out about some of the effects of this. So Eleanor Roosevelt High School is a sought-after school in the Upper East Side. Because they eliminated this catchment area priority, the zip code based priority, the number of offers that went to students outside of the district jumped from 1% all the way up to 62%. So that's, a step towards descreening, and that's something that New York City did this year. In San Francisco at the Lowell High School, they got rid of their GPA and standardized test assessment admissions criteria, and they used an admissions lottery. Okay, this is something that was initially a temporary policy, but now has become a permanent policy. And then finally, at the Thomas Jefferson High School, another selective school in Northern Virginia, this year they dropped teacher recommendations and standardized tests from admissions requirements. So you still need to submit an essay to be considered for TJ, but there's no longer a standardized test. So we're starting to hear stories like this. These are some of the more well-known schools across the country where people are thinking very carefully about changing admissions policies with COVID, with this impetus coming from our renewed emphasis on social justice. There's a big opportunity to think about increasing equitable access. And I think one important implication for us is that when we talk about equitable access, equity means different things to different people. Is this based on racial criteria, income criteria, geographic criteria? And I think it's very important for us to be precise on the goals that we have and what measures that we're targeting. Now, there is a huge opportunity for us because some temporary decisions have been made permanent, but there's also an opportunity to think more carefully about the policies that have been implemented. So I've certainly had many wary phone calls from enrollment offices where we don't know whether the decisions that are made under these pressing timelines and unusual circumstances are the best possible ones. And we now have an opportunity to evaluate and consider alternatives, much like Boston is going to be doing this summer. So we need to think about what is the best way to advance equity. Okay, now the simplest but maybe hardest answer is we should create more seats at schools that other people want, that are most sought after. But that's often hard to do. So should we tinker with admissions tests? Should we move from standardized tests to other types of assessment? Should we get rid of them altogether like the Lowell High School did? Should we get rid of other screens like geographic screening or open house priorities? Should we change the underlying lottery system? And the approach that we recommend depends on the context, and it depends on what the stakeholders in the community see as the desired outcome. But I would like to emphasize that if we could separate, our goals from the implementation of those goals, I think we can design more effective policies. And in many cases, we don't know what will happen unless we actually try to simulate what will happen. And so that's something that I strongly encourage folks to consider doing as they undertake these types of policy reforms. Okay, great. So let me wrap up here. Thank you guys so much for your attention. And I'd love to open it up to any questions or comments from the broader group. Actually, I see some questions here already. So there's one question here that's asking, in Chicago's system, free and reduced price lunch is a fairly crude measure of disadvantage. Is it possible that the neighborhood factors are actually picking up additional signals of disadvantage that don't show up in FRL? Granted, it's still a proxy, but a potentially better one. That is a fantastic question, and it gets at the heart of the issue. So what is the best way to measure disadvantage, right? So, one thing to note is in some districts, all students are eligible for a free and reduced price lunch. So it wouldn't be possible to use even that kind of measure. So certainly it is possible that the neighborhood factors pick up some other notions of disadvantage. And if that's what the city would like, it's a worthy goal. One of the things that we've been seeing about Chicago's system and any place-based system, I think that is challenging for the design of these policies, is that the types of students who are actually most likely to have a high enough score to qualify for Peyton and Northside. Actually, yes, so Tony Howard is saying all students in Chicago now receive a free lunch. Thank you, Tony. So I was saying one of the things that makes the design of these kinds of systems quite challenging is if I look at the characteristics of your neighborhood and I have a kid who is talented and is doing really well in school and is able to qualify for Peyton or Northside, then that kid is somehow unusual for his neighborhood, right? He's a very high scoring kid. in the citywide basis, so he'd be unusual for his neighborhood. So if we try to proxy for how disadvantaged that kid is based on the neighborhood, you're going to be dealing with a lot of noise, because the kids who are relevant for these high admission standards at those schools are going to be unrepresentative. And one way to see that actually is in Chicago. If you were to go back to the old system that actually had a race-based quota, that's a system that most of us think would not be allowed legally right now in the United States. And you say, how well does Chicago's old system of racial quota, so the system in place in 2008 and 2009, do in terms of income diversity as measured by free and reduced price lunch status, compared to the new system in Chicago, where we have this place-based consideration? It turns out, and this was very surprising to me, the old system actually generated more income diversity than the new system. And so that's just a way of saying that the correlation between FRL, where you live, and your race is quite elaborate and involved. So I would be skeptical whether these neighborhood factors in Chicago are predicting other measures of disadvantage that we can't pick up. I mean, ideally, we could try to assemble information on parental income or parental education levels and use those as part of admission systems. And that's something that I haven't seen done in many districts, but that would be a way to more accurately target disadvantage. Next question here. How can districts partner with researchers and/or state education organizations to get more complete data on family mobility and enrollment patterns, especially in the early grades? That is a lovely question. And one of the things that I'm always frustrated about as a researcher with COVID and this year is, some of the stuff I had to show you is, a little bit indirect evidence. So I'm showing you information from Google searches. Wouldn't it be much better to actually directly measure what's happening in classrooms and in schools? And we don't have an administrative data infrastructure that allows for us to measure these patterns once students have left the traditional public school district. So some of the enrollment facts that we'll get will be, I think, more refined and more rigorous once the school year is complete. We'll get actual head counts, we'll get measures of attendance, so on and so forth. There's always this issue, and we've heard this from a lot of our friends, that, measures of attendance this past year are quite noisy. But the question of, are children actually leaving the city and going elsewhere, or are children leaving the public district and going to private school but still staying in a given city, is something that's very challenging for us to crack, because those administrative data systems don't exist. And that's, I think, related to another question. What data do we have to support the idea that families are opting for private schools instead of public? This again is mostly by anecdote, because by virtue of being a private school, you're not subject to the same kind of data reporting requirements as traditional public schools. So, we've heard from some sectors. Now, it's not all private schools, but some private schools have seen boosts in enrollment. So that's our best evidence there, but it's certainly nothing systematic. It's just too early to have a really rigorous view on that. And I think that's important, because some of those decisions are sticky. So if we imagine that the decline in pre-K and K is caused by families saying, well, I don't want my kindergartner on Zoom school. And I can speak from experience. My child was a kindergartner on Zoom school. I don't blame them. Let's just wait a year and then enroll. Then maybe those families will come back to the traditional public schools, and we don't need to worry so much about enrollment. On the other hand, if a family says, I don't want my child in Zoom school in kindergarten, and I instead will go to private school, those decisions tend to stick. So barring large changes in the economic circumstances of a family, it may be hard for traditional public schools to attract those students back. There's another question here about the composite score in Chicago's system. So Chicago, the map I showed you had Chicago's census tracts broken into 4 groups. The 4 groups are constructed based on a composite index that takes into account, initially it was 5 factors, and now it includes 6 factors. Those factors, so off the top of my head, are things like the home ownership rate of the tract, measures of the education level of the tract, measures of the single-headedness of the tract, measures of English language speaking as the primary language in the tract, and the measure that they added in. And I can point you to some more details on this. We have actually a fair amount of research on this because this is a fascinating system for us. But the measure that they added after 1 year of the system is a measure of local area school performance. Now, none of these measures in Chicago include racial characteristics of the tract, okay? And to my knowledge, that's still an open question. So the courts, I think in the Pick's decision in 2007, said very clearly we should not use race as a factor in K through 12 admissions, following the standard from the Bollinger case, the standard being if you've tried everything else, maybe we could consider using race, but that's something that a district would have to take on and potentially be subject to court challenge. What we know nothing about is whether you can use the racial characteristics of the tract as part of an admission system. And to my knowledge, that none of the districts have done that. So Chicago's tract-based measure of disadvantage doesn't include racial attributes of the tract. Great. Terrific. Well, I think I'm almost at time, so I'm really grateful for you guys logging in. I'm so thrilled to hear from you guys. If you want to talk about any of these questions that came up during the talk in more detail, don't hesitate to reach out. We will make these slides available. There'll be a recording here. And we're going to try to do another webinar in about a month. And on that webinar, we'll be talking about best practices for K through 12 student admissions. And so the tentative date here is listed on the slides. The registration process will be very much like the webinar for today. And be on the lookout for the announcement for this, and if you want the slides from today's webinar. And thanks so much for logging in. And for those of you who are working in districts, keep up the good work. This has been a tough year, and I don't envy the position you've been in, but this is a great opportunity to think and reimagine the future. So thanks so much.